here with Ken Paulson, who is the Dean of the College of Media and Entertainment at Middle Tennessee State University. Mr. Paulson, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. In addition to being Dean here at MTSU, you are also the President and CEO of the First Amendment Center. You have a long and illustrious career as a journalist, most notably as the Editor-in-Chief of USA Today. And these experiences, I imagine, give you a really unique view of the intersection of media and entertainment. I wanted to know what you see in your current seat as a university administrator is going on right now in the world, the changes that are happening in media and entertainment.
Oh, it's a revolution, and the one constant is change. I've struggled with this a bit because we are teaching our students in our college in as contemporary a way as possible. But whatever app you teach them, whatever software you teach them, it will not serve them a decade from now.
Right.
The game will have changed that many. And so it feels to me like what we have to do now is teach comfort with change, teach receptivity to change. Create an environment in which young people say, I know things are changing, I know my job will change, but every time there's a change, I'm going to be prepared for it. I'm going to study for it, I'm going to embrace it, I'm going to become adept at that technology, and I'm never going to be intimidated by change. That's the most important thing we can pass along, because the environment is unprecedented.
Right.
I have to tell you, in 1993, I was one of the first half dozen newspaper editors to put content on the web. 1993, so a very long time ago, and yet we thought the world was changing quickly and dramatically, and the news business was stunned when digital took over, right?
Right.
We had 2 decades to plan for it. You don't have 2 decades to plan for anything anymore. You have 2 months before the world changes.
Right. So what kinds of things are you doing? I mean, how do you implement that at a university? What do you tell your students?
Well, one thing you tell them is experience, hands-on experience is golden. Mm. You don't want to come in to try to be a journalist and your senior year, you realize, I don't like talking to strangers. I'd really rather not talk to strangers.
Right.
You don't want to go there. So,
yeah.
So one of the things you do is try and throw them in the deep end as soon as possible, not without a life preserver, but have them have these experiences. And I want 18-year-olds walking into the college, even before they've taken a journalism class, to go and try and interview somebody, to photograph a news story, to take a shift on the campus radio station. That's critically important. Because if you walk in and there is a banquet of media opportunities for you, you're going to learn so much, you're going to figure out where your aptitude is. But you're also going to get in this mode of saying, I like it all. I'm not afraid of any of it.
I can do it.
I can do it. And if you have that, the classwork reinforces what you already know intuitively you can do.
What do you think that students or post-college age people should know about the challenges that the music industry specifically is facing right now?
Well, it's funny. There doesn't seem to be a widespread understanding of how badly the business model is broken. I had an opportunity to interview some candidates for a job in our college recently, and I think because I have a background as a journalist, I ask somewhat less predictable, somewhat unconventional questions. But this was not particularly odd. A full third to a half of our program here is music industry. Mm-hmm. So I asked, what do you think the biggest challenge Music Row, the home of the music industry in Nashville, faces? And one candidate after another said things like, finding new talent. And they'd have all these observations and not understand that no one is getting paid the way they were once paid.
Right.
I think the general public, because they still see the biggest names on television and they hear hit songs on the radio, have no idea that the recording industry business model has not just been turned on its head, been in a blender, and the result is unsteady ground for everybody who's in the business.
I heard you say once that you tell your students, you broke this, you fix it. What do you mean by that?
I joke that the unofficial motto of our College of Media and Entertainment is you broke it, you fix it, which means that I have a lot of 18, 19-year-olds walking in the door of this college they're going to be Jay-Z's producer. That's what they've decided they want to be. Or they're going to be the next Oprah. Or they're going to be the crusading editor of the New York Times. And I love dreams. I love energy and ambition. But those are not realistic dreams not just because they're hard jobs to get, but because that generation, those 18 and 19-year-olds have made choices in their lives that have forever altered the landscape. And so when an entire generation says, you know what, I'm not paying for music, I don't need to pay for music, it's all free on the internet, suddenly royalties for songwriters dry up, revenue for artists dries up, record companies dry up. And yet these same students walk in the door and they go, I hope to be a record company executive.
Right.
You've just put yourself out of a job because of your own patterns. And same thing with journalism. When young people decide they don't want to pay for the news, the newspapers are passé, don't then go looking for a traditional newspaper job. Now, I say this not in a chiding way. That's not right. Shame on you. It's you've made some choices that have altered the landscape. And now your challenge is to come in and get an education in these fields, but don't just learn what needs to be learned to do these jobs. Help us reinvent it. So we have a Center for Innovation in Media, and we are trying to push the envelope ourselves, developing apps, developing new ways to tell stories. We see students as being a big part of that. No one's a bigger expert on what 18 to 22-year-olds will take in form of media than 18 to 22-year-olds.
Right.
So I kind of throw it back at them and say, you have to be part of the solution because our ways are old ways, and you have to help us invent the new ways.
What ideas have you heard that excite you?
Well, there's so much out there that I often think there really isn't a new idea per se. Just variations on themes. So, you look at the disruptive behavior that led to the death of the shortening of the life of newspapers, and the recording industry, and then you go, okay, well, if you can deliver something to somebody more conveniently, you can use the internet as a delivery vehicle of some sort or a communications vehicle of some sort. If you can drive down the cost and make it more convenient, so that applied to newspapers and music to some extent.
Right.
Turns out it also applies to taxi cabs. And then you see Uber emerging.
Right.
And you just see this disruption model rolling out over and over again.
Right.
So when I think about new ideas, it's almost always, it's a variation on a theme, something somebody else has come up with that they apply to a new industry. And I think that's intriguing. And I keep, because my background's news, I keep hoping for the iTunes of news. I keep hoping that someone will find a way to convince the public that, hey, you need to be informed. But you can be informed for 8 cents a day with this plan or program or subscription. That's what I hunger for.
I wanted to ask you a question that's related to what you say about disruption that is also related to your work when it comes to free expression. At the age that I am now, never thought that I would find myself in a position where I miss some of the old gatekeepers in the music industry. And I want to ask you a question that's half serious, I guess. Do you think that there can be such a thing in an era where more people are making records than ever before, fewer people are buying them than ever before? Can there be too much expression? I kind of miss the guy who said to the mediocre musician, no, you're not ready yet. You don't get to make a record now. How does your commitment to free speech and free expression come up against your love of excellent work?
Well, there can never be too much free expression. It is what makes the world a vibrant place. It's interesting you use the phrase gatekeeper, and I think that's an interesting one because it suggests kind of limiting what gets in and what gets out. A traditional editor's role, I think, is invaluable, where you're saying, all these things happen in the world, and here are the 8 things that will most affect your life or your community. I think that's really valuable. It brings expertise. In the area of music, it truly is a mixed bag because, as you know from your own experience in music, when those gatekeepers existed, they often kept us from hearing really cool stuff.
Right.
If you listened just to top 40 radio when it existed, and it still exists to some extent, you didn't hear any ska. You heard a little reggae. You heard only certain forms of black music for the longest time. And so the gatekeepers were not always just guaranteeing quality; they were limiting our options.
Right.
And so that is a mixed bag.
This February 2015, the U.S. Copyright Office published a series of pretty nuanced and comprehensive recommendations to try to fix a complicated and messy kind of system that we've got in place now that's, as you know, a sort of Frankenstein that's been built over 100 years or so. I wonder if you have any reactions to what the U.S. Copyright Office's recommendations are.
Well, the recommendations and the evolution of copyright law in this country has been the result of lobbying by various organizations who have a financial stake in the outcome of every battle about royalty and compensation for creative work. And there's kind of a yin-yang to it. And in fact, in recent years, there's been tension between radio professionals, who I deeply respect, and artists, who I deeply respect. And it's really about getting your share of the pie. One thing I think is lost in all the conversation about copyright law is just how much copyright is at the core of this nation's character, and the way we approach art and the way we reward each other for good work. It's disheartening to me that so many people download music without paying for it, and it's called stealing, and losing sight of the fact that somebody created that work for sale,
right,
and
spent resources,
right, to do that.
To do it, yes.
And I would hope that somewhere in the mix we can find a way to do a better job of enforcing copyright. Mm-hmm. And that comes from somebody who believes wholeheartedly in free expression. But the First Amendment doesn't guarantee freedom of music or the ability to free
right.
distribution of music, I should say.
No, right.
But what a lot of people aren't aware of is that the Copyright Clause was written into the U.S. Constitution and has been a part of this country since our birth. And the reason for that is, in order for us to be creative and inventive, you had to make sure people were rewarded for their ideas and creativity.
Right.
And early on, someone would create a dictionary, right? Well, if you didn't have copyright protection for your dictionary, it's the easiest thing in the world to republish and to share with other people. Who's going to create a dictionary? Who would ever bother investing in all the research needed for an encyclopedia?
Right.
Why would you invent something if you were not protected against somebody stealing that?
Right.
So unless you promise creative and inventive people there will be reward for your hard work, there will be no hard work. There will be minimal creativity and few inventions. And so what we miss about copyright in this country is, because we made those guarantees, this fledgling nation grew by leaps and bounds in technology and the arts and creativity, and that has grown over centuries. Mm-hmm. But if you pull away copyright protection, if it's not meaningful, the art suffers, there are no inventions, the impulse to create is undermined. And so downloading a song and paying for it, it's actually kind of patriotic. It's the way we intended for the system to work. And I think too few people recognize that the expedience of taking a song without paying for it actually undercuts the kind of nation we are.
The subtitle for this course is "What is Music Worth?" How do you feel about the way that music, and really some of the other things that you've spoken about too, journalism, books, and so forth, is being valued today? I mean, there are a lot of different ways that you can sort of attach dollars to creative expression, but it's happening in a new kind of way, and I wonder, how you feel about that negotiation right now.
Well, I would offer maybe a bit of perspective about how we view riches in the recording industry and wealth in the media and journalism. It was only a certain period in our history, a very short period in our history. In journalism, probably 1955 to 1995, where newspaper publishers began making money hand over fist.
Right.
Rock and roll, Bo Diddley didn't make a lot of money.
Right.
It was only with
somebody made a lot of money on Bo Diddley,
right,
but he
right.
did. Yeah.
But even then, album sales were somewhat limited. You could make some money on a single, but from 1963, let's say, with the Beatles' advent, to early 90s again, people got enormously wealthy from sale of albums and songs and publishing rights. And I feel for today's songwriters who just keep plugging away, but their predecessors who had 2 big hits in 1974 could retire,
Yes.
Anyway, I think it's easy to fall in the trap of thinking those 4 decades, whether it's music or news, are the normal thing.
Right.
When in fact, I think we're actually returning to normalcy. If you were a musician before 1950, there weren't a lot of recordings for you to get revenue from. You would play with a dance band that played a lot of Glenn Miller, perhaps, or you were a troubadour or folk singer. Woody Guthrie wasn't rolling in the big dollars.
Mm-hmm.
That just wasn't the way the music business worked. People valued music for the way it made their heart feel, the way it moved people, what it said about society. Poets are still waiting for their good four decades.
Right.
Those have never kicked in. Same thing with the news media. I often talk to newspaper editors who are extremely depressed. And oddly enough, one of my presentations is called The Real Value of Newspapers. And what I point out is that newspapers were the ones to make abolition possible. They were the ones who took the lead on fighting slavery. The suffrage newspapers were the ones who encouraged the movement that allowed women to vote. Throughout history, newspapers have been among the leaders in changing community mindsets about integration and civil rights. And all those newspapers, from really the beginning of this nation's history, they didn't make a lot, but they made enough to make a difference.
Right.
And that difference changed the path of our country. So the real value of newspapers is how it has changed the very fabric of our nation by informing people about the need for change. And I think you kind of have to step back when you talk about the music industry and say, there's the business model and then there's the art.
Right.
And we have to be grateful that the art is there, that there's still some commerce associated with the art, but the business model is never going back to what it was.
So would you agree with a person who argues that a true musician is going to have to make music whether or not there's any money involved, or a true writer is going to have to write his book whether or not there's any money involved?
I think your muse will drive your free time and your creative output. But I do think the difference is that where there is a business model that supports the art, that person does not have to deliver for Amazon during the day.
Right.
It doesn't have to have another job. When there was, John Prine could give up being a mailman once he signed. And so, over time I've co-written a couple of books, kind of ghostwritten another, and those were interesting experiences. But the notion of committing to writing a book without significant compensation in my free time means I'm going to have to make a lot of other choices about what I don't do in my free time.
Right.
And I think that's a big thing that changes, that you lose the economic incentive to be a musician all the time, to be an artist all the time, to be an author all the time.
Right.
It's very hard to be just that anymore.
Right. And that kind of carries me back to what you said earlier about people maybe not understanding the consequences of not buying music. I mean, that means that John Prine would have had his, keep on with his job, and that we have a lot of John Prines, even here within
Right.
100 miles of where we
Right.
sit, who are keeping their jobs. And that's the thing that I would like to have, folks sort of connect the dots a little bit more about, what happens when a person with great talent can commit 100% of their time to their art.
Right. Well, and you look at how that has played out, and how the industry is different now. There was a time when an artist who was talented would put out a first album. If it didn't break big, they could put out a second album and a third
Right.
album. So you would never have. John Prine, luckily, his first album, endorsed by Chris Christopherson and Paul Anka, made it. It was successful.
Right.
But not Steve Goodman, his writing partner and friend. There would not have been a second Steve Goodman album, let alone a third, fourth,
Right.
eighth, or ninth. And I think what we used to relish was the artistic development of people we love to hear.
Right.
And I think that's truncated
Yes.
in an environment where there's not support. People of a certain age who, and I'm among them, who were actually around for the initial release of each Beatles album, it was like, oh man, Revolver was amazing, but what's next? And
Right.
and then Sgt. Pepper, and it was like, oh man, they reinvented that, and the White Album was a different spin. And anyway, you could see artists growing and evolving.
Right.
And now, without sort of the equivalent of patronage, somebody to make sure you have the time and space to develop your art,
Right.
everybody becomes a one-hit wonder or a no-hit wonder.
I heard in a video interview with Lindsey Buckingham from Fleetwood Mac recently, where he said basically what you're saying. He said, when you are in the zone, he was talking about the making of the Rumors album, and he said, when you're in the zone with people like that and you are throwing everything you've got and making the greatest piece of art that you can, he was like, you need a lot of people around you that are taking care of your day-to-day needs, basically feeding you and telling you where to go and pointing to, the next place that you need to be, and so forth. And that during that era where there was a lot of support financially for these kinds of endeavors, that's also, of course, the era where you get the stereotypical sort of, misbehaving, childlike,
Right.
petulant rock star. But, there's something to that, I think.
And there's a way to look at Fleetwood Mac doing what they did in the studio, illicit and otherwise. That's actually R&D. It's research and development. They played, they experimented, and they created new products in the form of songs that no one had heard before.
Right.
Like a Tusk, where you go, wow, that's just bizarre.
Right.
But they had the freedom to do that, and R&D is missing from music now, and R&D is missing from the news media generally too. Everybody's trying to adapt the existing forms to make a payoff, but they don't want to cut in that profit margin because that profit margin is closing. So we're not seeing terribly inventive approaches to music now, except that which is generated by the artist.
Well, maybe we can wrap up with another note about this idea of community, because I think now is a very exciting time in Middle Tennessee and in Nashville, as well as the surrounding areas. There's a lot of, as you say, creative people with a collaborative kind of spirit, and it's not just in music either. I should say probably it's in restaurants and clothing designers and all kinds of stuff is going on. And I wonder what you think people, our learners, can do to create those kinds of collaborative, creative, spaces or events in their own communities. What are the best things that people can do to support arts and creativity in their own home communities?
Well, I think something like a house concert is a great way to start. There are talented people who, especially in towns in which there are not a lot of clubs or nightclubs or opportunities, but to be able to gather together in somebody's home, someone performs a set, and there are 40, 50 people from the community there. Mm-hmm. That begets an additional house concert for somebody else and somebody else. And in communities across the country, this is actually happening, where they're self-creating the music community. In Nashville, it's easy because it is a company town. It is all about music, and so it doesn't take long for you to sit down in any public environment and begin talking to somebody about music, and you're off and running, and you have mutual friends always.
Right.
But in towns where that doesn't exist, I think creating a safe, supportive place for people to play new songs, to share with others, and pass the hat at the end of the evening, that is the very best way to build a music community.
I agree. Thank you so much for your time today, Ken.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it. We've been speaking with Dean Ken Paulson from the College of Media and Entertainment at MTSU.